Hello and a warm collisions YYC. Welcome to my guest this morning, Mr. Charles St-Arnaud. How you doing, Charles?
I'm good, yourself.
I am fabulous. Thank you so much for coming on. You and I have been already chatting away. So like as I often catches myself, I need to push record so we can get this on the air. You are chief economist at Alberta Central. And the amount of things that are normally in your world, let alone what are in your world today. It's March 13th. I want to be really clear with the audience because things we talk about today could change in an hour from now based on the world that we live in. So give us a quick, what do you do? What's your role? What's the world you live in? And then we'll pick a series of topics, and we're not going to start with tariffs. That's my promise to myself today, was we're not going to start with the low hanging fruit that is the domineering the news cycle right now.
Yeah. Well, as a chief economist, I look at everything that could affect the Alberta economy and the Canadian economy. But obviously, it involves looking at what's going on around the world and big trends because, Alberta and Canada, we're not islands. We're affected by everything that's happening around the globe, especially right now. Our economy is really driven by exports, and what's going on in the global economy matters a lot.
And that's nothing new. The old joke, we're price takers, we're not price setters. We are at the mercy of the market. With that filter in mind, no small task, by the way. I do appreciate how easily you rolled that out, but yet how grand in scope that it is. Taking tariffs off the table for the sake that it's a bit nauseating. We will talk about it because we have to. What are some of the other things that are on your radar? If that was maybe status quo, or maybe just let's talk about it. What are some of those other bigger trends that maybe are getting washed out a little bit in the current news cycle?
Yeah, well, I think if we start with Alberta, there's a big trend that's been going on for 10 years in our economy. We're still adjusting to the bust of the mid-2010 in the oil sector. That sector has changed dramatically and fundamentally. We're not seeing the same level of investment in the industry. We're not seeing a new boom coming up, and the new boom might not actually happen ever again. But it also means that our economy is changing. We have seen a convergence in, for example, wage in Alberta versus the rest of the country. We're still slightly above, but not like as an example, our wages were about 10% high, 15% higher than the rest of Canada in 2015. They're now about 5%.
Okay, interesting.
So that kind of changed a bit the dynamics under the ground here. But it's also without having that boom, which is probably the ship might have sailed because of other global factors, especially that we know all the forecasts for oil are showing that we should get peak demand somewhere in 2030, depending if some says early 2030s, some says late 2030s, but at some point. So the question is, do you need to add tremendous capacity at that point, considering it takes time to develop project and all that? Right. So that's kind of the economics behind it. We're still going to be producing oil in 40 years from now in Alberta. That's almost a guarantee. And we were talking about it because oil doesn't need just to be refined and burned in a motor. There's a lot of industrial fact. We can all drive an EV tomorrow morning. We all need a road, and that road will be made of asphalt.
And we need tires to put on the car. We need so many things that it plays a bigger part in terms of the economic, the industrial cycle. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll still be producing the raw material. It's just going to be used in different ways.
But if we get rid of the boom, do we also get rid of the bust? I guess maybe. Do we get a payoff? Yeah, do we get a payoff?
That's where I was coming up. That's the silver lining, is that if you don't have a boom, you don't have the excess. If you don't have excess, well, there's nothing to be removed. So we may actually have a more stable economy. And the way I see the oil sector is that I see it as a startup or a tech company in slow motion. The mid 20s, so from 2005 to 2015 to the bust, was kind of the fast growth where you just pour money as much as you can. You don't really care about productivity, about the profitability. You just want to boost your output, create the business. And that was kind of the oil sense of that time. Now you're kind of in more a mature environment. Your investment is there. It's producing, and it's producing extremely good revenues. We're producing for about $10 billion a month of oil. So that's
And
about
our
30.
ability to get it out of the ground. I know companies, if my wife's had a 20 person, 10,000, what they do with 20 people, they used to would have had 30 or 40. Like this, they're so much more efficient.
Yeah,
They literally do more with less.
yeah, they do more or less, but they're still generating so much revenue and economic value out of it so that it's still a very big positive for the economy. It still contributes for about 25 to 30% of our economy, even though we don't have that boom. So it's still very important, but we might have, so it's a more steady growth
Yeah.
than that ups and down cycle. The other part where it's actually positive is that not having a boom actually might help us diversify our economy or actually allow
Yeah.
other businesses to grow. And it's funny when I ask, like when I speak to entrepreneurs here in Calgary, especially in the tech industry, they all say the same thing. They would have never started their business in the mid 2010s because they all say the same thing. Why would I have had to hire an engineer 25% more than what I would pay him in Toronto or Vancouver to probably get him poached by the oil industry within a month?
That was a very real, yeah. I hate to say it out loud because I know how much it is. That downturn was the best thing that happened to our journey of diversification, which has been a topic of conversation since the 80s in Alberta, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is that now other companies have the room to grow because before you had that big sector, the oil sector, that was basically just swallowing everything.
Consuming everything in its path. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was nothing left. So now you can have other businesses that are growing, but you're benefiting from that boom just because of those.
It still backstops the whole party. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, when you say, what are some of the other sectors that, are on your radar? Because it's easy to say tech, which is pretty broad. Breaking that down a little bit, you still got 25 to 30% of the economy contribution from the energy sector. Even inside the energy sector, there's everybody from I'm drilling versus I'm a service company. I'm a tech company servicing that sector. What are some of the areas you look at on that forecast that, wow, in 5 or 10 years, they're going to be more of an outsized, influencer on our economy?
well, obviously, when we look at Alberta in general, like the tech industry, anything that's derived from our expertise in oil. So we see a lot more investment in chemicals and all that. Sometimes I feel we need also to be careful and look a bit further down the road where things are going.
Okay.
I'm looking at, for example, petrochemicals is a great idea. We're pushing a lot on plastics and all that. Where I'm a bit more concerned is where is that going to be in 15, 20 years from now? I used to live in Europe 5 years ago, and compostable plastic were everywhere. And you come to North America and you realize, we're kind of behind, but are we going there? And I'm like, okay, we have under good capacity and understanding of chemicals, of petroleum, and all that. We also have a big agricultural sector. Is there a way to combine those two forces and to be a leader in that, where we could maybe use our agricultural waste to create biodegradable plastics?
Mm-hmm.
That is probably where
I
we're
love the
going in
idea
20 years from now.
of putting two industries in a room and not letting them come out until they figure out a way to do something together, which sometimes we're not good at. We stick in our lanes too much. And I do love that. Who could we force to collaborate and what might come out of it idea?
And it's the same when we talk about energy. We're starting in the past few years, but when I arrived in Alberta in 2019, I was like, well, we just in a slump in investment in the oil and gas industry. We have all those drillers that are not necessarily fully employed yet. How can we not use that capacity and develop our geothermal capacity?
Mm-hmm.
Like
and those are things you hear talked about, but yet as an outsider, it's like, that makes perfect sense. But yet we seem to be still slow to make some of those changes because it's easy to talk about on a podcast.
And that's the thing is that as a province, we have a lot of great expertise, but I don't think we are good at finding new ways to do that, to use that expertise. And geothermal is a great idea. It's a great example. We have the best drillers in the world, yet why are we not using that skill where it's in high demand everywhere in the world?
Interesting. There's the layers of complexity and also the just change. And, it's so easy to not be able to look at what's possible, when you're so comfortable with the area that you're in.
Yeah.
And that's just, I
But
think that's also human sometimes.
yeah, but I think it goes also to another big issue we have in Canada in general. We're terribly bad at business investment, at research and development, at being
The true
in
early stage.
and being innovative. Like we we're talking, you were asking what are the kind of the economic issue that keeps you at night
Mhm.
is our productivity in Canada is appalling. And part of it is that we're not investing enough in business investment, machinery and equipment, in intellectual property, and all those part of things.
And is that like, who should be leading that? Like, and again, not to point blame, but I'm looking at, again, whose role is what? Is the government's role to then invest there and maybe get out of the way in other places? Is that private sector? Is that some of the individuals in our country or, organizations that have done very well reinvesting versus taking money off the table? Trying to look at not who to point at, but who can we elevate or who can we hold, ask to help us there?
It's very complex. And the problem is, and I've done work on that, is that I'm not sure a lot of those who are in charge, whether it's government officials or really understand the whole ramification of the problem. Productivity is not just an issue that, oh, we should just incentivize businesses to invest. Yeah, it helps. But there's also a whole ecosystem that needs to be also taken care of.
Looking at the full journey.
Going from because I wrote on it, like you look at the past 30 years in Canada, the share of bank lendings or general capital going to the housing market in terms of mortgages and all that has consistently increased over the past 30 years at the expense of capital going to businesses.
Interesting.
So yeah, if you don't, and as an economist, we deal with how you allocate resources. Well, capital resources are finite. If you give more to households borrowing for mortgage for ever so more expensive homes, well, it's less money being available for businesses. So basically, you've had actually what we call in economic term a crowding out of the business sector by the household sector. But part of it is, I don't want to blame the financial institutions, is that if you have $1 million to lend, would you rather lend it to a residential mortgage where you have an appreciating collateral, so basically it's risk-free, or lend that $1 million to a small business to buy machinery that in 5 years will be worth much less?
Yeah.
So it's complicated, and then that's why I say,
and yet amongst all that, we still don't have enough housing for our population. So it's an interesting, like it didn't actually even solve the problem, or here we are when you look at how do you swell the country, bring in immigration, and we don't have room to house these people, but yet the same situation has been brewing over the last 30 years. Are these types of we're speaking on one thing in general, like do these take major inflection points to change? Like what needs to blow up, and it's a terrible term to use, to actually go, whoa, because these things have their own momentum, they have their own trends, they have their own energy. And 30 years is that's a lot of reversal.
Well, the problem is that there's a lot of inertia.
Yeah.
We're talking about housing. I'm sorry, but we knew there was an issue with housing in Toronto and Vancouver for the past 20 years.
True.
And unfortunately, public officials decided not to do anything because, one, it was not an emergency, and it was not necessarily popular and bringing vote.
I was going to say it might lead to not a second term or whatever the case may be.
Well, to put it crudely, and I published on that last year because it was coming from my frustration of politicians talking about housing affordability. But what does it mean? Well, in a place like Toronto, it means that house prices needs to be half of what they are now. No homeowners will be voting for that.
That's a very unpopular idea.
And if it's not
in a lot of places, but especially in Canada, when so much of individual net worth is tied up in your home.
Yeah. And if it's not that, and you're hoping that income is catching up, it's going to take 18 years. So
I appreciate just the reality of that statement of the weight. That's 18 years if we probably stop the trend of it probably is forever if you don't change the mechanism, right? That's only 18 years if you change things now. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that's the thing is the sobering fact that, but the problem is that it's unpopular or it was not a priority. And often we leave the problem to fester until we have the back on the wall and we're like, oh, we have no choice. Housing affordability is a great example. We've known for decades that there's an issue. Like at least 10 years, we knew there was something
And during that
needed to be
period of
done.
time, the price of houses have continued to rise, especially in those two markets. I know they've corrected slightly, but nowhere near what you're talking about.
Yeah. Productivity is the same thing. I remember when I was a young student in economics in the 90s, we were talking about issues of productivity with Canada. And we fast forward now 30 years later, and we're still talking about it. It's like,
it has when you speak about, and I never pretend to know what I don't know.
Yes.
When you really look at productivity as a metric, I think we all have a definition we can easily apply to it in our minds. Like, oh yeah, we're doing less, or we can't, you're not as productive as you used to be, or I didn't have a productive day. When you think about it from an economic calculation, what are we actually like? What are some of the levers that we're measuring there that's driving that down? And the same question, then how would we drive them back up if we were to make a shift there?
Well, productivity basically is how much you produce per hour's worked.
Okay.
As simple as that.
Output per hour. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And productivity doesn't mean working harder. It actually means working smarter.
So the same rule that applies to each of us as individuals as well.
Yeah, because that's what you want. You want actually that for my same 35 hours a day, I can produce 10%, 20% more. And that's the thing, the more you produce for the same amount of hour, the more pay you can get for those hours that you work.
Which then comes back to the salary. One only correlates to the other. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's where the weak productivity growth is such an issue right now, is that, and it goes into, we saw over the past few years, GDP per capita in Canada has been declining. So it's that we're not producing as much per hour. So our income is not increasing as much. We complain about the cost of living. Well, it all comes together, but they're very slow moving. It's not something that's going to be solved tomorrow and we're all fine. It needs to be a whole kind of a wholesale change of the way we see the economy.
Which feels like, to your point, these are not new concepts. They've been around for many years, but the average individual, especially the recent inflation, and to your point, I need more because life exponentially costs more than it did 3 or 4 years ago, which I think all of us, but yet to your point, if productivity is going down, just take this back to the individual organization. How do you even afford to keep up? Because there's a point where then you become non-sustainable as a business or non-viable as a business. Like it is an interesting kind of the crux of it. And it feels like we're heading to an inflection point where one is getting broken by the other to the point that it can't just be pushed to the next election cycle.
Yeah. And it's, the thing is, as much as we love to look at current government, it's a succession of government that have planted the seed from where we are. Some have done more damage than others. Some have just didn't do anything and just served because, well, it was not an issue. So why solve it? So, and it's not. And also what's important in Canada, and I think it's something that's often missed in the discussion, is that sometimes I find in Canada, there's a cultural problem where we are afraid of failure. Or failure must be stopped at all costs. And you see that a lot in some of the government policy.
It's funny, which is kind of the opposite of the capital. Like if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and it fails, and something else better replaces it. Yep. We've gotten to the too big to fail, that's very interesting. I think you're absolutely right on that.
And not necessarily too big to fail is that, and for me, that realization really comes from two parts. One is, I remember last year in January, we got the business bankruptcies data that spiked up really strongly. And part of it was just because you had the repayment of the CBA loans from during COVID. But for me, it was like, well, if you couldn't repay CBA after that amount, that was supposed to be temporary support. That means that you're probably bankrupt.
Yeah, you were insolvent long before that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe it was time for you to go. And why I think it's important. When I started my career, I started at the Bank of Canada and I was covering Japan. And my experience covering Japan showed one thing. What has been called the lost decade in Japan was, probably initially was the shock from the bursting of their asset bubbles. what made it was prolonged for a decade and more was the lack of cleaning up after the mess, cleaning up after the failure.
Saving
What's
face.
matter?
Saving
Well,
face.
not just that is
Yeah. No, I'm being very, very
no,
culturally specific on this.
but it's true. It's saving the face, not obviously because banks and clients had a very intimate relationship. So you didn't want to create bankruptcies on someone that had been helping you for years. So there was a lot of that. But by doing that, and by the government not wanting to force people to realize their loss, you don't have the reallocation of resources that is needed.
It literally drags it out.
So you have resources that are used in non-productive way that could be, if that company was to go bankrupt, be realigned. At the time, a lot of the issues were in the bank. The banks had massive amount of non-performing loans that, yeah, they were not necessarily bankrupt because they were making part of the payment, but they would never be repaid. So you have all
it wasn't a productive. Yeah, I understand.
So you have all that capital that was never redeployed to new industry, to new business that would have been most likely more productive and more competitive than the old one. So we kind of feel that we have a bit of that tendency in Canada that we don't want to cause failure. But failure is not the problem. Failure should be actually swift and making sure that, and I say the resource, I say capital, but I also say workers, that the workers also realigned as quickly as possible to other sectors for their own sake. Because if they don't get reoriented, they might be underemployed, not making enough money, and where they could be actually retrained and actually be productive.
Versus that tendency to almost protect it because it's been around, because it has legacy, because it has history and going. And there's a lot of those institutions that become very protectionist to just be the institution of what I'm using that word very broadly. They protect themselves versus having that hard decision because so many people are relying on it staying it's built in that staying the same is better than it changing. But to your point, you're just dragging out a failure.
And it's also I can also understand it's risky and it's scary. Yeah. It's scary to.
It's easy to sit here and talk about because that sooner or later there's humans that will be affected. I never want to downplay that. When you look around, use Japan as an example. Obviously, we're like when you look at this on a global stage, kind of where Canada's at now, some similarities to where Japan was at, maybe even where Japan is at now. Or is there other parts? And you having a global preview and having experience working overseas. Where are we kind of in our journey compared to other nations, or maybe some of the hard lessons that we need to learn? Or is there also a way out of this that maybe doesn't have as many casualties? Because it's easy to throw that around as well.
Yeah, that's where it's hard. The question is, the adjustment will be difficult. So it's either we do short-term pain for long-term gain, or it will be a long slug to improve because we're not going to turn around on a dime.
Yeah. I'm sensing option 2 is probably what we seem to be opting for.
Well, that's the path of least resistance. And it's the path that is comfortable and that politicians will prefer. And the general public will prefer too.
Yes.
It might not be the fastest and I would give a great example. Spain right now, one of the fastest country in Europe. They had a very nasty financial crisis in the early 2010. But it cleaned up a lot of their economy and allowed them to increase. Even our neighbors to the south. A lot of the reason why they are outperforming now, yes, there's a lot of fiscal stimulus and all that, but consumers are not as heavily indebted as we are. So they have more disposable income to spend. They are less risk averse because
of what they went through not that long ago.
Yeah, it was painful.
Yeah,
anyone who has American friends who, like myself, I live in the U.S. in the early 2010. You could see the pain for many.
Mm-hmm. But it did move on and started on one of the greatest kind of runs that it had after that. When you look at when the bottom was to where it ran, it was kind of almost unbelievable because to your point, the big reset button, which was pushed, which again, I never want to downplay the impact. Yeah.
The only problem is that we also have to look in, especially in the case of the US, is the winners and the losers are not the same.
Yeah.
So that's where
there is a stratification to that, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's where it's a bit more complicated is that when it happens fast is how do you make sure that no one is that you don't have a whole set of the population that's completely left behind and left to do whatever they like to fend for themselves. That
I bought into a certain set of promises that now were no longer fulfilled. That leads to a very disenfranchised. That you're taking away their agency. They're taking So I listened to a podcast yesterday, and they were talking about the rise of AI and the impact on the white collar worker. And his comment was like, well, this is exactly what happened to the factory worker not that long ago. We started outsourcing jobs and we left these people with like, hey, if you work hard and do the thing, there's a promise that you will be taken care of. And we pulled the rug, because that same rug is getting pulled out slowly, but maybe all of a sudden in the world of knowledge workers.
Yeah. Well, to make a parallel to our upcoming topics on tariffs. That's the reason why so many Americans do not believe on that trade is a win-win situation. Is that,
because it wasn't for them, to your point.
Yeah. So if you did it, or as I say, yeah, it has been a win. Yes, prices haven't increased that much, or things are cheaper than they were in terms of relative to your income. But if you don't have an income to pay for it,
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter to you.
Yeah, I'd much rather have my job and have my situation. So I know we'll get into tariffs here because we have to, and also I am kind of curious. Obviously, we had a rate cut yesterday, a quarter point, 2.75. I'm really curious where your thoughts are and kind of where this economy is going. Where we've got a rate cut because we're trying to, inflation is under control ish. Now all of a sudden we might have tariff-based inflation. I was reading some longer-term forecasts. They got really scary about where this might end up. Costs go up, interest rates go down, but then sooner or later, things exponentially expand cost-wise, and then interest rates need to go up while in a recessionary market. It got really scary. The article didn't leave me in a good stance. So I'm curious, when you start running this out in your mind, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road, pending the tariff kerfuffle keeps going on, does this put us in a potentially really bad spot down the road?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, the best answer and the most honest answer, we don't know. Okay. We do not have a clue for different reasons. And that's the problem, is that I agree there's a lot of risk and all that, but understanding and knowing what the exact scenario is going to happen is almost impossible. One is that to do that, you need to know what President Trump will actually put in place for how long and the details and all that.
So, good luck. I think if anything has been proven, is good luck to knowing that.
I think the past 2 months have shown that, nobody knows. And I think even his cabinet has no idea where he's going.
It doesn't seem like,
Maybe him too. So that ship has sailed. So already we don't know what's going to hit us. We don't know how it's going to hit us. So we cannot really prepare. We can make simulation, but it's completely off. Then, as an economist, you're like, well, okay, let's look at history. Let's have our nice models that are calibrated on history. Well, I'm sorry, but 25% tariffs on Canadian goods by the US never happened.
Yeah, unprecedented.
Or never happened in a context where we are so geared to the US economy. 20% of our GDP is export to the US. So with that in mind, it's hard to get really precise estimates of what's going on. And the size, and if one thing I always say, and that's where a lot of the Bank of Canada in particular kind of erred in during the pandemic, is that the speed of the changes, speed of the shock, and the size of the shock matters a lot. Often the speed matters more than the size. And in COVID, the speed and the size of the shock on energy prices was bigger than what we had in the 70s. So no wonder in a country like Canada, where everything has to be transported using energy, price pressures are seen all across the board. So it's the same now. A big increase of 25% in one go. It's not clear how that can be absorbed by businesses in their profit margin. It's not clear how consumers are going to react. It's not clear. Does it become
a tax? Does it get simply passed through? And I've been chatting to a lot of my business friends. They're like, no, it's not as cut and dried as just passing it through. What are you doing? Like the laundry list of things to consider are quite significant. Like the complexity, the size and the speed of the number, and then the complexity of what to do with it.
Yeah. So the way to do it is to look at it I call it kind of having a decision tree of potential outcome. So let's say, we have tariffs. Okay, what is the size? Which industry is going to be more affected? So let's say we put let's take the 25-10 configuration because that's
Hmm.
the one that we've been hearing the
It
most.
seems to be the most popular. I agree.
Well, the most talk about.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, popular is a matter of perspective.
So, okay, we know with that, it will have a negative hit on our exports, depending on which industry, whether or not you're more price sensitive or not. So obviously, manufacturing will be harder hit than, for
Mhm.
example, oil, because, well, even the 10% will have an impact, but 10% increase in oil prices, it's kind of the realm of almost normal volatility.
And you've got a
So,
bit of a devaluation from a dollar perspective. So like we're kind of splitting the difference a little bit on that one too, to a certain degree. Like when you take
but
10%, maybe it becomes more like 6%.
and that's the thing, and in the term of oil, does it gets into absorbed by the spread between Western Canada Select and WTI? So
Yeah.
there's all that. So there's a lot already of uncertainty in terms of what is going to kind of provide some buffer
Hmm.
to the impact. So we know you'll get lower output because of lower exports. You'll have some job losses. Obviously, those job losses will be more important in manufacturing, where it's a more labor intensive area than, for example, energy or mining and things like that, where it's more capital intensive. So the hit is going to be much harder on places like Ontario and Quebec, which are more geared towards uh, manufacturing
Yeah.
product, than towards Alberta or
Versus
Saskatchewan.
natural resources versus labor based. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but obviously, manufacturing sector in Alberta is going to be hit pretty much, but because it's a smaller size of the economy, we're going to see it a bit less. Or
Okay.
it will be less predominant in the data that we'll get.
And
So
also in terms of the everyday, like actual economic impact on the province. Mhm.
yeah, so then you have weaker economic activity, higher unemployment. That will create deflationary pressure. So you'll have lower inflation. That's in the case if we don't have retaliation from the Canadian government.
Like
You'll
literally
have
tariff based inflation.
Yeah, you'll have a bit of inflation coming from the weaker dollar. What I actually find that's very interesting for the Canadian dollar is that it peaked in the initial announcement of tariffs in early February, and we've been actually extremely stable right
Hmm.
now in the same range we've
It
been
hasn't
since.
plummeted. It hasn't plummeted. Yeah.
And my view on it is that we have to think about it is that an exchange rate is a relative price. There's two sides of the equation that is moving. Is that the Canadian dollar last fall was depreciating because of the Canadian side. Now I think is that there's more and more realization that, oh, but tariffs are going to be negative to the US. So the US dollar side is
I had a
also,
friend kind of walk me through that the other day, just exactly that. You're like, yeah, you got to look at it from both sides of that dollar. Yeah. Hmm.
again, I used to be a foreign exchange
Okay,
strategist, so
so
I'm
very much top of mind for you. Yeah.
yeah, in
And
New
when you
York
look at
City and
the
London.
US
So
the US dollar against other currencies around the world, it paints maybe a bit of a better picture, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
the US dollar has depreciated a lot against a lot of other currencies because
Yeah.
there's starting to be signs that the US is slowing. Is it
Hmm.
going to be a recession that's up to still up to grab? They
Yeah.
will see, but there's clearly signs that the economy is slowing, so that's putting downward pressure on the US dollar. So it also opens that. We were thinking
Back to your
that,
point about just another variable.
and that's the thing. We were thinking, oh, there'll be a big depreciation of the Canadian dollar because of tariffs. Maybe there won't be. So again, it
Yeah.
complicates what's the impact. So, but the depreciation in the Canadian dollar will be inflationary. So to sum that up, you have deflationary pressures coming from weaker economic activity in Canada. You have some inflationary pressures coming from the weaker currency, but as I was discussing,
Hmm.
it's not clear we'll get a lot more from here. So
Interesting.
in that case, yeah, the Bank of Canada will probably look more towards weaker output and the deflationary pressure from that and continue cutting.
Yeah.
Then there's the other part. What if we retaliate? Well, retaliation is tariffs on Canadian imports. That increase our cost here in Canada, putting more pressure, upward pressure on prices. And that actually complicates the job of the Bank of Canada even more. Is that,
Yeah.
inflation is higher.
We're
There's,
we're basically creating that. We're falsely elevating that. And
yeah, but,
And is that like from an economics, purely economics? Because I understand the rhetoric of like, oh, you slap me, I slap you, a little tit for tat kind of thing.
Yeah.
Economically, that doesn't sound like that's actually, if we take all the other emotions out of it, that doesn't sound like it's economically the right choice. This is cutting off. This is literally cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's exactly that. It's that you need to be careful how you do it. And so far, the Canadian government has been more towards how can I hit specific group that could influence decision making.
That actually have lobby and an ear with the president, like basically, right?
Yeah. Bourbon and whiskey from Tennessee and Kentucky.
That makes for good headlines. Let's be honest.
It makes for good headlines. It makes also because they are red states that could potentially push their own party towards something. The question is it working, and will it be working? But that is fine.
It's too soon to tell. Yeah.
And I think, and for now, it's fine. If my bourbon is more expensive, well, I'll get some Scotch or I'll get some Canadian whiskey. Like I'll find something else.
Yeah, I'll choose differently.
And so the cost on the economy is not that big.
Because those are pure discretionary costs.
But when it becomes to be other things, if we start to put tariffs on other parts of some manufacturing, like some I don't know, some fittings that goes into house building or building materials, and suddenly we have housing affordability, and yet we also increase the cost of building houses. That's where it starts to be a problem, and that's where we need to be in somewhat careful in terms of how we do it.
Very deliberate and strategic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's where the discussion sometimes maybe doing export taxes could be a bit better.
Okay.
And because then at least you get some revenues where you can help some of those affected. But we also have to take into account the relative size of both economy. Again, I was saying we export 20% of our GDP to the US. The US export, I think it's 4% roughly of their GDP to Canada.
I didn't know that number. So, yeah.
So how much more tariffs do we need to put on them for actually to hurt their economy? We probably have the time to kill ourselves before we actually make a big
yes,
dent.
We'll kill the patient before we even get to the cure.
Yeah. So and that's
interesting.
That's the whole context, but that's the purely 100% economic context.
Yes.
Economics is never in a vacuum. There's always a politics. I always say I love the English language because there's politics and policy. You don't have the French language, and they mean completely different things. But you cannot do policy without politics.
That is. We joked earlier about the languages we use to describe things matters. Absolutely. I've heard lots of talk about, you know what, if we just put down interprovincial trade barriers, this would solve part of our problem. And I've also talked to friends that are much more versed in how we run as a series of provinces and federal versus that's not nearly as easy as saying it. Any thoughts on that from an economic or forecasting that out? And like the downturn in Alberta being a good thing for diversification, does this force us or give us enough of a shock to change our ways?
I'm hoping so.
Okay,
because it's
I appreciate
due to
change. In these crazy times, a little hope is okay.
Well, I feel sometimes tariffs might be the kick that we needed to actually get our house in order. We've been very complacent for not necessarily bad reason. When you have a giant next door that will purchase whatever you produce, why would you fight too hard and spend too much money to try to find new market when it's easy? You just build it and they come and get it. So
it's the classic case study we've all read about being too reliant on one customer. Like it's not a new concept, but you don't say no to that good customer either. That doesn't make sense either.
Well, he pays your bill and he pays well, and he's there. He's been there for the past 3 decades, day in, day out, purchasing everything you build. So, and it's that. So, but now we're kind of realizing that maybe that customer is not that reliant. So who do I find else? And obviously, interprovincial trade is an important one. Mm-hmm. One, because it creates new market, but also it might help some structural issues that we have in Canada, is that we have businesses that have a hard time scaling up because we don't have the internal market.
Hmm.
Like in the US, it's easy for someone to start small and be big. You have an internal market of almost 400 million people.
Totally. Hmm.
In Canada, we're 40 million. But if you're in Alberta and you only have access to almost 5 million people, you're not growing at the same pace.
Yeah, just the sheer numbers of it all.
So,
And
that's
then
how
also looking out beyond our borders, looking, obviously the story of being able to get our energy to different markets is
yeah,
a story as long as I think Canada is, certainly from an Alberta perspective.
yeah.
But these are consumers that want our energy as well. Like these are consumers that are looking for the opportunity once we get our ability to get it to them. It's so easy to oversimplify and see that as a like if not now, then when?
Yeah, but at the same time, if we look at energy, like yes, there've been all those projects to bring more oil to either coast and all that. But again, the attraction has always been let's send it to the U.S. because
Mhm.
it's a hungry customer.
Yeah,
He wants that
yeah,
oil.
yeah.
He's consuming a lot of it. And it's easy. It's much easier to build a pipeline across the prairies than it is across the Rockies.
Yeah, 100%. And to your point
Just
about maybe energy not being as disrupted, that probably there's more motivation to keep those pathways in place.
yeah, and but
And that customer is still equally motivated to consume that product to the same, like that hasn't changed amongst all this noise, right?
well, we'll see because it's always the concern is that with the whole not that they could really switch around and be like self-sufficient in energy by
Hmm.
any mean, but they're a whole the drill baby drill,
I
and
was going to say it's the perfect time to
it's
say that line.
it's
Absolutely.
it's a concern. Not
Yeah.
that they have the capacity or all that. It will take them a lot of time and a lot of money and investment to get there. But they could also try to find some alternative supplier.
Hmm.
Because, yeah, we all know Alberta produces heavy oil, but we're not the only producers of heavy oil.
Hmm.
And there's a big country called Venezuela that's also that.
Hmm.
Thankfully for us, President Trump doesn't like Venezuela,
Well,
so
it has
we're
its own
not.
set of turmoil, especially in the last 10 years, right?
Yeah, but
But nothing's
my
off the table to your point about unpredictability.
yeah, so it's complicated. And when we think about interprovincial and expanding our territory, it's also thinking in terms of often hear, oh, we should have diversified 10 years ago. It's like, yeah, but 10 years ago, someone would have told you that, oh, we need to spend, I don't know, $50 billion to build all that new rail system to go to the West Coast and all that. But why?
That would have been
If
an unpopular.
that's the thing,
Yeah,
if like,
yeah.
but we're sending that to the US, so why are we building it if we don't really need it or don't use it at full capacity? Now it comes in handy, but at the time would have been considered a waste of public money.
Yeah. We are notoriously bad at predicting the future.
No one is.
Yeah.
No one is. And in the Canadian context, again, we had a very big customer that was happily buying everything we had, but that unfortunately changed.
Maybe for now. Just to put that on the asterisk, but I
Yeah.
feel that the relationship now is fundamentally changed, and we're yet to determine what the new world will look like.
Yeah, and I think the mistake a lot of people have been making in Canada is framing the whole tariff discussion and Trump into just, oh, you just want to negotiate better terms on everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
I heard that a lot in the early times. Yeah.
and it goes way beyond. For the way I see Trump is that I see there's four versions of
Hmm.
Trump tariffs. Like I call it the first one I call it the transactional Trump, which is basically, oh yeah, I'll slap tariff to get something concession on
Kind of
something.
the art of the deal, Trump, basically.
Yeah, but then you have what I call the isolationist Trump, which is a completely new Trump and a big change in the way the
Hmm.
US is positioning itself around the world. Basically, what Trump is saying is that I am no longer gonna be involved in things that are outside of my border unless you pay me.
Unless they benefit me directly.
Yeah. Or if you pay me, give me money. You want to be
Which
under
is a direct benefit. Yeah. Like,
yeah, you want to be
fee for service.
yeah, well, or give me some favor or something. So
Yep.
you want to be like Canada. Oh, you need our help to defend the Arctic. Sorry, it's going to cost you. even though we're joined on in the NORAD and all that. No, you have to pay, and that's tariffs. Um, Same with Europe. Same, we saw it with Ukraine. Is that you
Hmm.
want our help? Well, give us all your give us some money in terms of minerals.
Which, from a business perspective, if you look at it if you look at it just in a bubble, you're like, well, it doesn't not make sense. Which is, again, not to support or not, but try to look at everything objectively.
But again, it's looking at it in just a business way and not looking that business same as economics
Is
as a politics dimension. There's a geopolitical dimension because the US got a lot of free pass in very places because they were there defending, and they got a
Mhm.
lot of goodwill to get access to market and access to everything because, well,
And resources, and yeah, we could unpack some of those things you're talking.
and
Yeah.
also a lot of decision making in global issues
Mhm.
that they're going. So they might not have benefited from it directly financially, but being involved and in some ways almost directing the direction of the decision has almost as much value.
Mhm.
And that has been kind of the US we've been used to since the Second World War.
Yeah. That's,
So that's kind of the,
that's two. What are the other two? Which I think we
yeah.
chatted about this briefly the other day. These are all great. Mm.
The third one, I call it the expansionist Trump. How do you use tariff to expand your zone of influence or territorial control?
Mhm.
I think Greenland is a great example of that. Canada, the 51st state, is definitely part of that. Because let's be honest, if we always say, oh, well, but he needs Canada, he needs our resource, so why does he put tariffs? Well, if we're part of the US, there's no more tariffs anymore,
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
has a
If that
resource.
first part is universally true, the second part just becomes a means to an end.
And I think we need to be serious, and like it started as a bad joke, but I feel there's more seriousness around it than we think.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah,
and
read into the humor, because oftentimes, yeah, to your point. Mm.
yeah, and for me, it's a constant persistence on it. So yeah, so
Yeah.
we saw it like Canada, we saw it with Greenland, we see it with Panama, we see it with Ukraine. Is the same thing too. Is that you want our help to defend you against the Russian? Well, give me your resources, and you'll be fine. So it's a different approach. It's very much transactional in some ways. And the last one, I call it the industrialist Trump, is by creating tariffs and creating the chaos. He's bringing back investment and production in the US. There's that big push
Hmm.
to bring back manufacturing. And that's part of the idea with tariffs is that if it's too expensive to produce outside, well, produce inside.
Hmm.
And at the same time,
And
it's like,
that's a much longer game to play,
yeah,
which means that this will be around for a long time. That isn't a passing. It isn't a passing. It isn't transactional. It actually is, like, from infrastructure. It changes the infrastructure of how the U.S. functions. Mm.
yeah. And that's why tariffs are likely to be there for a while, depending on, and that's where politics in the US might come in play and will be interesting to see is that the way the tariffs are set up, they're made through executive order. So
Hmm.
right now, Congress can just say, well, if it goes bad, they can blame, well, it's the government's idea, it's the president's idea, it's not ours. So they don't own the mess. But to become permanent, they will need to go and pass
Oh,
Congress.
so that puts into a whole level of interesting in
So
terms of what level of buy-in now he has within that side. Which, you're right, it's been very distant at this point. Mm.
yeah, at this point is
Hmm.
that they've been pushed. They've been kind of okay. It's the Trump show. If in 6 months' time it's blow up completely, we can just blame or
Hmm.
say blame him for everything and save the face and save the next election, or at least save my seat because hey, I was not
Yeah.
part of that.
Yes. Back to what we're talking about earlier about who has the appetite to do what on what kind of election cycle. And I do appreciate the fact that from a political standpoint, he's not scared to, like, offend and and tip
Yeah,
over the apple cart. Mm.
and at the same time, uh, the chaos is creating and the uncertainty is creating is also helping him because right now uncertainty in Canada has never been so high.
Hmm.
So business investment is going down. We actually saw it. The Bank of Canada was saying yesterday they're seeing business investment intention being kind of declining. Consumers are kind of pushing back on purchases and all that. But by creating that, because of that uncertainty, but by creating that uncertainty, he also managed to bring back investment out of Canada to the US. Because I always put in the case, you're a manufacturer, you're thinking of building a new factory somewhere in Canada to service the US. In the current environment, you're probably saying, you know what, I'm not interested. I, I could make more money by putting in Canada and shipping, but now it's like, you know what, I'll put it in the US. I'll swallow
It's just
that
easy.
cost.
Yeah.
It's just easier because I know with a certainty that next year that factory is still going, it's still working. I'm not pouring millions of dollars that might actually be a sunk cost within a year because all the politics have changed. So that's kind of the initial phase, and that's what we're seeing now. But the longer that uncertainty lasts, the more permanent damage it creates. An example we can think is that you're a car manufacturer in Southern Ontario. You have an old production line that still working, but it's kind of towards the end of its useful life. It needs to be modernized. What do you do now? Do you modernize in Canada or you build a fully new one in the US? And I think those kind of decisions are starting to be considered.
And those are the real impact you don't see for a
Yeah.
considerable period of time.
And in
But
some ways,
there are also decisions that are you don't walk back from them quickly either. Once that
yeah,
decision's made, then that's the decision, and you go where the sense of security is.
yeah. And for President Trump, there's also a win on his side. He can get that without really imposing tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that actually the cost as an increase and the impact on inflation on their side in the US is not as big. So he almost gets a win-win situation on his side by continuously drumming up uncertainty and keeping it high.
Which, based on the rhetoric of the last 2 months, it's hard not to see that as part of the playbook, because
Yep.
the instability of the what is it, and it almost feels better now. If you're going to do it, just do it. But that's maybe not the objective. To
Yeah.
your point. Mhm.
It's the same like when we were starting to talk about the whole tariffs. There was a lot of analysts were saying, well, yeah, but you cannot do it. Tariffs would be illegal under the USMCA. And I'm like, you're not a strategist. Because quite frankly, if you're Trump, you put tariffs and ask question later. Because how long is it going to take to have a court judgment against those tariffs?
Yeah.
We have a great example in Canada with softwood lumber that's been going on for decades. So you have the time by acting illegally, you have the time to create permanent damage at little cost on their
Because of the
side.
system that you're playing in, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So and you have to think like that with someone like President Trump who has shown that he's willing to go down those roads.
Yeah. What's possible when you don't have those limitations of this right wrong social contract, and when that doesn't hold you back, it's limitless in the society that we live in.
Yeah.
Right, wrong, or illegal, or otherwise, to your point. But the damage is already done of that. And I've already seen that. We've already seen it in our own clients. So I've already seen it in some of our sales pipeline. Well, we're going to wait. We're not sure. The uncertainty, it is literally kryptonite for business.
Yeah. Well, I always say uncertainty might actually be the slow killer for the economy. The longer it lasts, that might actually is going to drive us into a recession. We've seen that in the past.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at the financial crisis in Canada was a great example of an uncertainty and confidence crisis. Is that suddenly we have the banking sector in the US blowing up. We had our own hiccup, yes.
But it was very nominal in contrast to the US.
Yeah, but we still had a recession, and a lot of it was that extreme uncertainty. It's like, well, like people were comparing. It's like a cardiac arrest. Everything stopped, and then okay, we know where it goes, but it takes time to restart. The only difference now is that we're being affected, and it's gonna be permanent.
Interesting
Impact.
Charles, a very interesting conversation. I won't say inspiring, educational. I love the reality and I love the different perspectives that you take in kind of looking at things. And we're all trying to navigate the unknown. There is no playbook, like you said, and you were very honest. And I don't know. Nobody actually knows. But if we start to look at some of these different variables and, there's certainly no reality that this is not to be taken very seriously. And I think everybody is. To your point, this isn't just a rhetoric and noise. This could be the new normal. That's a weird, I don't know if I like that statement or I don't, but
yeah,
gets overused. That's for sure. But I feel we might be talking again. I feel I might have questions that I need asked in 3 or 6 months to go, Charles, help me understand what the heck is going on. If somebody wants to follow, and I should know this, do you have a channel that you publish on, or are you on YouTube? Where would someone go to hear some of your thoughts? And because I know you're always putting out content.
Yeah, I put out all my content on LinkedIn, and I also have a newsletter through albertacentral.com. So our website.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Excellent.
so people can subscribe, so they will get data comment and more kind of longer analysis that I do.
I appreciate your willingness to also share a little bit of an opinion, because it's interesting when you analyze data, someone still has to go, okay, here's what we think based on what we know in this moment that it means or doesn't mean.
Well, it's important to provide colors, and it's important to provide colors in a different way, because I find sometimes I would fault sometimes the economic profession to have a group think of not wanting to kind of consider different ways, different ideas.
Which is it's easy to swim with the crowd, right? Versus going, hey, this might not be right, might be wrong, but let's look at it from a different perspective. And I think in a world we live in where groupthink or jumping to conclusions with 140 characters, the more information you can absorb, the maybe better chance you have for a little bit more of a critical opinion.
And to link it to what's going on in the US, I think it's also important to go and understand where they're coming from and use language that will resonate with them. Because I find a lot of what we've done so far, like sending our premiers to Washington and preaching the win-win of free trade. But if the other party doesn't believe in it, the only thing they hear is like the teacher in Charlie Brown.
Communicating, well, understand your audience, understand what they think, what they believe, and communicate it in a language that they can understand, right? If you just keep, it literally is the parents from Charlie Brown, the teacher. Wah.
And in your line of business, that's exactly what you do. It's, can I get a message that comes across to the other person? And that's often what is missed 100%. In a lot of discussion, whether it's in the US tariffs, whether it's within Canada. Like I find sometimes a lot of our issues internally comes from the way we talk about issues and the type of information we're willing to push to the other party. Does that information really resonate the way we think it is, or it doesn't?
It's understanding the agenda from both sides. And if you're only pushing your agenda, we all know that shuts down. Nobody likes being spoken to in that way. Literally spoken at, maybe is a better way to say it.
Yeah.
Which I fault, and I joke about this sometimes. I don't have a lot of politicians on the show because they're not willing to have dialogue. They're just willing to keep nailing me with talking points. I'm like, this is not a conversation, and my understanding of how a conversation works. And it's okay if we don't agree. That's also part of a good dialogue. But until you get there, you don't usually get to it. And to do that on the international stage, it seems like that's not necessarily a skill, or maybe that's what happens. I'm always hope that happens maybe behind the scenes of what I don't see on the nightly news, where maybe the real problems get solved and the deals get done.
Yeah. As I always say, often the reality will be in between.
Yes, somewhere in the middle. Yes, I need more choices. Charles, thanks for coming on. Thanks for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.